Hi, everyone, and welcome to this fourth discussion as part of the Provocations, Conversations, Iterations series at Slow Moco. To provide a little context, this project began back in 2018 at the Conference on Movement and Computing. And John and I launched an open call for provocations on the question of what escapes computation in interactive performance. We have a growing collection of provocations that are housed online, and this project has continued in the years since. We've been collaborating also with Jessica Rajko, so the three of us are facilitating events right now as part of the extended format of MoCo, Slow MoCo. And what we wanted to do was to bring back together provocateurs, those who have submitted provocations in response to this question, to bring them into conversation with one another, to look at relationships between their provocations, to iterate on these provocations in this new context in which we find ourselves. So we are thrilled to have here with us today Zhi Xu, Jean-Philippe Rivière, and Jessica Rajko, who is an organizer, but today also acting as a provocateur because she submitted a provocation back in 2018. So with that, I will hand it over to the provocateurs to give a brief sort of overview and reflection back on their provocations, and then we'll move into more open discussion. So Jessica, you are first.
I am first. It's really fun to sort of switch hats for a moment and be in the provocateur space again, and to review these provocations in this context, which is different and exciting. So for today, for my provocation, I actually just thought I would read it. That felt good to me. I think in many ways because I still stand by a lot of what I said, so that feels nice to sort of go back and read it again. So here's what I wrote back in 2018. As I began to write, Ananya Chatterjee's work immediately came to mind. Chatterjee questions the dominance of somatically informed postmodern methods of listening to the body as having ownership over embodied discourse within dance. In this, she does not discredit or devalue such work, but instead articulates that to assume these practices and affiliated research universally speak to the whole of embodied experience both flattens such inquiry and omits other perspectives, particularly those that consider sociocultural, political, and economic ideologies to be inextricably entangled within our multi-layered notions of embodiment. Considering Chatterjee's arguments within the context of this discussion, I asked the following questions, sort of its own provocation upon provocations. Does the somatic postmodern practice of deconstructing embodied experience along spatial, temporal, kinesthetic, and anatomical parameters neatly align with the limitations, goals, and aims of computational practices? Another question is, if so, are we aware that this neat coupling both flattens our work and excludes other embodied perspectives? And lastly, is our flattening of embodiment akin to what Norman, or in this case, Sally Jane Norman, defines as the making of ideal lab spaces, or a clean room type boxes of level floors materially bounded to facilitate rigging and equipment maintenance, and the marking up of well delineated test areas? Unquote. So if so, what happens if we, and to quote again, diversify and extend the limits of our analytical apparatus, end quote. My point here is not to devalue or dramatically change our practices, but to question how the repetition of specific disciplinary coupling, namely somatically informed dance of postmodern lineages and movement sensing from interaction design, cultivates a flattening definition of meaningful research and pleasing aesthetics within the field. My aim is to better understand the gaps and limits and assumptions we make about our practices, not necessarily to change them, but to better articulate their value and the limitations beyond the scope of the field. So I wrote this just thinking a little bit about this notion of escape. And escape is something that is in reference to repetition or the sort of repeated ongoing practices that then sort of define what could be constituted as best practices within an area. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Fascinating. What I submitted in 2018 is a part of my PhD research. The whole performance called X-Body. And the video I submitted in 2018 called The Variable Body. So I explore three perspectives during the research. I'm interested in body memories, cultural identity, and technology-driven choreographic mindset. So as a professional dancer trained since I was 12 years old with classical dance, ballet, and contemporary dance, I'm interested what escapes in interactive performance is the perspective from a choreographer. As technology, it's always a teamwork, working with designer, with the engineers. So I'm curious how I can explain my choreographic concept to the designers who are working in a different field and who might not trained with dance. Of course, we can explain the ideas to them, but how they can perceive like my own body. So that's why I'm curious about the technology-driven choreographic mindset. And I also argue cultural identity escapes in the computation. So as a Chinese dancer, I'm curious that cultural identity important in interactive dance. So for example, I trained with Chinese classical dance when I wear a sensor, mini B, when I use the gesture. So what kind of the data can send to the computer? Or it's same like everyone, like JPE, like Teoma to vary it. So I'm curious what kind of the cultural gestures can captured by the machine and then can generate graphics. So what this different kind of aesthetics generated. So, and also body memories I mentioned, how the trained cultural dancing body can be triggered in digital performance. So I work with motion tracing, working with software. So how my body interacted with the digital double or digital effects. So how I can develop the movement generations. So all these three questions were explored in 2018 and are also interested for me in this year. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, so I will read my provocation too. But just I want to give a bit of context about when I wrote it and why I decided to write these things. So it was in 2019 and I was just starting my PhD thesis. So I was in the first year and I was kind of a rookie in research and I was trying to really understand what's happening in dance and how do dancers learn to dance, what kind of strategies are using and how they can apply what they know to other type of movements. And so back at the time, I was really focusing on what is experience. What does it mean for a dancer to be a novice or what is to be an expert, and how that we can compute experience and why it's so difficult to do that in dance. So how can we say that someone is an expert and someone is not an expert or someone is an amateur? And how you can compute that. And I was really into that when I started my thesis. So my provocation was that, in my opinion, if I had to choose from the vast panel of what escape computation in artistic performance, I would say experience. Experience of the performer, but also the experience of the audience. Through experience, the performer will develop a proper style and will create a performance different from that of someone else. And the same way, someone who looks at the performance will look at this performance through the prism of their own experience. Even a self-learning machine may itself have a different experience from ours. In fact, there is kind of a paradox here. The fact of learning something will prevent the machine or even a human to quantify or compute experience. Because that, my opinion was that, because that would be the subject to its own interpretation. that we cannot really understand what is experienced through interactive performance. And in my opinion, this escape computation. So why is experience so deeply in us that cannot really, or for me, the machine cannot really understand. And even if it's an intelligent machine, they have their own experience, and then they will try to understand. They will try to through their own experience, they will have this freedom that they will understand everything through their own interpretation. So that was the idea. But as I said at the beginning, I think there is a lot of things. There's a vast panel of things that escape computation, and it's super interesting to talk about that with you. So now, should I ask question?
Sure, go
Sure,
for it.
please.
Kick us off.
Okay. So Jessica, so I have some question for you. You
Sure.
wrote that the social, cultural, political, and economic ideologies are inextricably entangled with our multiple layered notion of embodiment. And well, in fact, I totally agree with you, because it's part of the embodied experience, right? And my question is, so how can we define methods to, like, as human, as researcher, can we in fact understand that? Is this kind of idea escaping from us human, or it's just escaping from the vast computation in general, or it's also escaping to us? And
Such a good,
if
yeah,
not,
sorry.
what are the existing methodologies that encompasses such aspect of embodiment? So what are the methodology to take these things into account?
Yeah, I think, I mean, to sort of answer your question, but also sort of dance around it a bit, I think that these things are always already here. It's just, what are we talking about? So I think, sociocultural ideologies, political ideologies, economic ideologies are already at play in what we do. It's just, so maybe it's not so much for me a method of like, how do we do it? It's just, how are we acknowledging that it's already happening, and it's just not something we talk about in the ways, and like the structures of research that we understand them to be don't really necessarily bring those into the dialogue of how we define our work all of the time, even though they're already always happening. And I think if we were to look at, I think I'll keep answering the question because we can we can come back to it in a moment. But if we were to look at other, and a lot of this came from me as, as somebody who's a movement practitioner who comes from those very spaces of like postmodern aesthetics and coming from a sort of a concert dance lineage, but being in a department at the time that was entangled with artists who are coming from other dance practices, such as hip hop, different forms of different social dance forms, ballroom, and in social partner dance forms, and sort of having this experience of seeing the ways in which their practice always already entangles very sort of clear dialogue around histories, around social context, around political ideology and the like, as part of the practice itself. I felt like it was sort of integral in a way that I feel like we've sort of modularly taken out when we move things into computational spaces. We acknowledge that they exist, but we don't necessarily talk about it. So that was something for me, just to start to sort of prod at that a little bit, and to say, what does that do in terms of how people feel like they could or couldn't arrive into the dialogue if it feels necessary to their work, but there isn't a practice of making it legible within what we do. So I kind of answered your question, JP, as you were, Jean-Philippe, as you were gonna come back, but I'm happy to re-paraphrase anything if you'd like to hear it again.
Sure. Sorry, because there's a storm outside and my connection is dropping.
It's the realities
So
of this
if you
moment.
can.
Yeah, I
Sorry.
think I just to sort of like quickly summarize, I think I was sort of saying that I don't think these things, it's not necessarily about a method of bringing them in. It's just a method. And again, that's why I talk about not changing. I'm not necessarily interested in saying we need to change what we do. It's just more acknowledging the ways that they're already present in what we're doing. And then I was sort of articulating that I do think that there are other, and I'm speaking in the context of dance, there are other dance forms that already keep these things entangled. I'm just going to leave it there, and then if he comes back, I'll mention it again. But maybe we can pivot. And I'm curious. I think one thing I saw, Zhi Xu, between your provocation and Jean-Philippe, so is this sort of notion. I was looking about experience and identity, and from my perspective of watching the video you submitted as your provocation, it was really interesting to note the sort of like solo performer. It was who was very present in her performance, and in a sense of like we were to. I felt like I was to see her, not necessarily her as an abstraction of movement or her as sort of like a person. And I was curious if you could, I mean, that was my reading of it. So, that could totally not be what was intended, but I just wanted to Maria to like bring that into the space and talk a little bit about that, the presence of performer in the work and how you're thinking through that.
Thank you, Jessica.
Mm-hmm.
So that time, in the 2018, that was the first year of my PhD research. So I have to be honest, that time my knowledge was limited. So I fully followed my curiosity. So that time I worked with Max MSP and jetted software. So I want to learn the software and choreography the work by myself, and also design the patches by myself. So as I mentioned, I'm curious if there is not a professional team working with engineers, animation designers, so how can I do this kind of technology and the dance research? So how can I design a digital environment by myself as a choreographer? Because I know exactly what I want, and I can manipulate with the patches, with the software, and unprofessionally, of course. So from the video, I explored the female dancer, Jia Jie. So she graduated from the Professional Dance Academy as well. And I agree with you. I saw the dialogue between the dancer and the digital bubble. So the relationship between them rather than the identity. So, but that video was only a part of the whole piece. The whole piece was 50 minutes, premiered in 2018, and then reached stage at the place in 2019. So that was the solo, but the whole work was a group dance. So I was one of the performers as well. So yes, it was a group work, and I agree from that piece, the relationship was between the moving body and the digital effects. But after that, I more explored how the intrinsic perception from a choreographer to create the digital environment. So that's another story. Yeah. I'll stop it here.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I have a question to you, Jessica. I love your publication. So could you introduce a little bit about the policing aesthetics? I'm very interested with this concept. So could you introduce a little bit this notion in your publication, please?
Sorry, which concept?
The concept of policing aesthetics.
Okay.
So I'm curious about this idea.
Yeah, I'm like, did I say that? I'm thinking about it. I'm like, did I say policing aesthetics? That feels really, when you say it out loud, it feels very.
Sorry for my pronunciation, Jessica.
No. That's not it. I'm just thinking about the word policing, especially in this moment. I think. I maybe I will step back if I said policing aesthetics to maybe think a little bit more about aesthetic frameworks that sort of bind or have a sort of an inherent boundary around what is and isn't considered part of the work. And so I think it's the reason I step back from the notion of policing is I actually think that a lot of what happens aesthetically isn't necessarily about sort of intentionally excluding or including. It's more so about the things we get into a culture of practice that's done through those who are in the room doing the work, and the room being sort of largely like, as a metaphor, but those who are sort of creating the work and citing each other, and the citational practices of, well, these are the people doing the work, here's who I cite, here's who's sort of being defined as experts in the field that I have to refer to. And it creates a repetition that sort of, it becomes a filter, is a way to think about it, a filter by which we have to understand or put our work through in order to be part of the thing that is being created. And I think that in and of itself, in any context, not just here in this area of movement computing, in any context, starts to sort of define a community. It defines a sort of an aesthetic. It defines like what types of conversations are considered part of. And for me, it's not to say that that's a bad thing. I think it always happens, but to say maybe we should have a conversation about what that is, because I think oftentimes it is there, but it is undiscussed. And so if it's not discussed, those who sort of work outside of don't have something clear or understandable in which to say, well, I see this that you've defined and I'm doing this, so that it could broaden or become more porous. And that's part of it, and I think this comes from having taught, and I'd be in a space where I have folks who don't come from a sort of concert dance lineage coming into these practices. And it's like, well, but that doesn't work for me, or like, that's not the conversation I want to have, or, this space, like the physical space, you put Marley down, I wear sneakers, now I can't do my work, so like there are all of these ways in which there's sort of practice-based gatekeeping that I don't think we intend, and isn't necessarily intended to be exclusionary, but feels that way when we can't talk about it. If we don't know how to talk about it, then it's sort of like, and folks have to sort of talk about it in order to sort of acknowledge it. That becomes really kind of precarious in a way that I don't think we always account for, if that makes sense.
Fascinating idea. I love it. And your conversation just reminded me how I worked with professional dancers or the concert dancers. They trained with their dancing body, and also how I worked with the older when I teach at a community in Kingston. So I teach the older how they dance, how they use body to improve the mental health before the pandemic in 2018. Yes, that's a fascinating idea. The policing aesthetics, I love it.
JP's and Jean-Philippe, since welcome. I had a question for you, just to
Sure.
sort of like think through. When I was reading your provocation, it's interesting. It's so nice to hear your contextualization of what you define as experience in that moment. Because when I hear the word experience, I was thinking there's been a lot of conversation and in this provocation process around experience being more like in the sense of human experience, of like the things that we bring to the table through our own histories and practices and embodied habits and whatever that might be. And so I was I still want to ask the question though, because I'm curious, even though that's the framing in which I had the question I brought to the table. But I was thinking about notions of experience in relation to AI, because I think about where AI was in 2018 and where AI is now. And because part of what you talked about was like machine learning and notions of like machines being able to learn themselves, which for me just like immediately conjured up questions of AI. And I was curious to put, if you don't want to go there and you want to go somewhere else, that's fine. But it's something that popped in my mind. It's like, what does that mean now?
I can talk about that. The point is, I'm not an expert here, but I can still talk about technology. And well, I think my mind, the term experience is super vast. So it encompasses a lot of topics. So what I was trying to say in my provocation is that whatever you see, whatever you experience, whatever you see, whatever you do, is because that you have inside experience of what you should do or what you want to do. And I think that AI, for the example, AI, if they are learning something, they also have an experience. They have, but in the term of AI, it's not like blood or brain cells. In terms of AI, it's just like connection or algorithm, in fact. but it's still like why it's not experience. That's the question. Why AI cannot have experience? Because if they learn, if they have a memory, if they are learning things, if they can see something and learn from it, it's still for me experience. It's still something that they all the model behind them. When you train the AI, all the model are for me what I could call experience, but it's not the same experience as a human, right? So what do you think? Do you think that the term experience should just be used for human, or it can be used by AI? That was kind of a question for myself when I was writing this.
Yeah, I mean, it made me think about the subjectivity of the machine, or like the subjectivity of computation, and not necessarily something that only has to be human. And that feels, I don't know, it just felt more present now, maybe than in 2018, and maybe that's just my own self-awareness of where AI was at the time. But
at the
because
time,
AI has come into popular conversation more.
Well, it was still popular in 2018. In fact, it was. But it started to become popular. But now it's more and more popular, of course. Yeah. But at the end, the principle of AI is still the same that in 2018, even before. It's just that we have more computation. In fact, we have bigger computer. We have bigger like chips and etc. etc. So we can compute more things. But at the end, the idea behind is the same, right? So yeah, I would call that machine have experience. They can. I don't know if they have feelings. Probably not for the moment, but they probably have experience. And through the model, they will experience something, and they will maybe restitute it not as good as they should do. But that's why there is a lot of ethic problem in AI, because as human, we gave them their own experience, and so we kind of we are painting the AI how like by our experience we are creating the AI we want it to be. But then the AI is kind of standalone and it's going in the wild, and they interpret everything through how we as human we gave the interpretation. In fact,
yeah, I mean, and it makes me think about, I think because it's been more part of the popular discourse, there's more general discussion on like how AI actually comes to be. And I think about like the massive amounts of human training data that make AI possible. So I think I don't know. And it's just interesting. Again, it makes me think about modularity a little bit, or like the idea of like things being or not being, as opposed to like always being and just like what we're talking about. Because I think it's like, is AI really AI in the sense of like how we talk about it metaphorically or not? Is it actually separate from human subjectivity if like most of what creates it is actually human training data and like people, like massive amounts of humans doing rote tasks in order to sort of like implement that into what we constitute as AI. I don't know. These are a lot, like, again, we're in a provocation space, so that's just like where my brain goes, but I don't know.
To jump in for a second, and I think it ties back to this, Jessica, in your provocation, you spoke about the sort of flattening when there's a representation or a coupling between movement and representations in media or sound. And Zhi Xu, earlier you spoke about the idea that if any of us were wearing a sensor and producing a gesture, that it might produce the same sort of outcome or representation in the media, no matter which one of us was wearing it. So I thought that was sort of an interesting parallel in this question of flattening. But my question then, with what Jean-Philippe has brought in now, is, well, what about also if there's machine learning and AI inside of whatever is producing that gesture mapping, then whose experience are we talking about, or how does that relate to this notion of flattening and of what escapes or of what exceeds computation? It's a question for any of you.
Oh, that's so dense in a great way. I feel like that was a provocation in and of itself.
Maybe a rhetorical question.
But I do think it sort of necessarily complicates, right? Like, I think it necessarily complicates a lot of what we're talking about. And I think, you know, I'm just going to speak it really briefly, and then I would love to hear from both of you. But I makes me think a little bit about just being able to articulate the edges of things, not necessarily to sort of continue containering, but to notice that containers happen. Because I think one of the reasons I found my provocation necessary was because a lot of the ways in which we talk in the field is that we're talking about dance, or we're talking about human movement, or we're talking about experience, and the universalist notion of those things. And that for me is like where the problem is. It's like, well, none of these things are universal. So, or, you know, can we even talk towards aspirations of universality, or like, what is that tension point? I just don't think that for me was why it felt necessary, and why I would talk about flattening, because it sort of, for me, oftentimes speaks beyond the capacity it has and what it's doing.
Well, fabulous. I really love all of the different directions that this has taken, and new ones that we haven't discussed yet in the context of this project. So it's nice how bringing these three provocations together brought new things to the surface. We really appreciate each of your engagement with this. So as you know, we're continuing the discussions online through the Discord channel for Slow Moko, and we have an event coming up to continue discussing. So this is really just touching the surface. We would love to continue. And thank you so much to each of you for taking part in this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you all. That was really a pleasure.